Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. Welcome ASM members and welcome guests of ASM tonight. It's wonderful to have so many of you here, and I am very pleased to introduce Ryan Peterson. Ryan is a distinguished 2018 graduate of Northern Michigan University, where his undergraduate major was anthropology, focusing on archaeology. Ryan's continued these studies at Indiana University, where he received his master's degree in 2021. And currently he's a doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology at IU, where his focus is in the area of archaeometallurgy, specifically in the copper working Native American cultures of the Upper Great Lakes. Now, in addition to everything he's been studying, he has participated in several archaeological digs on Isle Royal in Michigan's Lake Superior. And this field work discovered multiple items associated with the production of cultural items from native copper deposits. From the characteristic tool indentations and impressions on these items, Ryan has been able to focus on recreating the handcraft techniques that the Native American artisans used to produce the copper-based artifacts. And these artifacts and objects have been found as far away as southern Missouri, which indicates that these copper items were a valuable trade item amongst the ancient Native American cultures. So as I've mentioned, we're most fortunate to have Ryan with us tonight to explore both this aspect of metallurgical history and to view an ancient production method. So with that, Ryan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to take a second here and share my screen. Present. Okay, there we go. You guys should all now be viewing my appropriate screen. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight to see my presentation, Archaeometallurgy, Ancient Copperworking in the Upper Great Lakes. Tonight, I'm going to be doing an overview of the ancient copperworking metallurgical technology that has existed in the Great Lakes over the past 10,000 years. To get us started, I'm going to give us a solid general overview of ancient metalworking globally, and then use that to kind of zoom in on the Great Lakes as a whole. And from there, I'm going to track some of the general trends, specifically focusing on the Upper Great Lakes for metal usage over the past 10,000 years, ending actually with a demonstration of some of the metalworking techniques and technologies that have been used over the past 10,000 years. So my research focuses specifically on copper production and value in the Upper Great Lakes during a time period called the Nipissing High Paleo Lake Level event, existing about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And this map here kind of gives you an idea of the area that I'm studying. And what I'm looking at is how technological systems, particularly metal systems, metal copper systems, were organized during this time period. And how I'm doing that is I'm looking at a series of sites that are distributed across this landscape, starting here on Isle Royal, which is one of the sources of copper, and looking at sites both on Isle Royal and along the North Shore up here in Lake Superior. And what I'm looking at with that is, where is copper being produced on the landscape as it's moving away from its origin? Are there different stages as you move away? And how is that overall system organized? And then taking that system and looking at the different values that can then be attributed to the organization of a system such as this. And the field of study I belong to is what we would call archaeometallurgy. This is essentially a very small niche branch of archaeology. Archaeometallurgy is an interdisciplinary and international field that studies and examines all aspects of the production, use, and consumption of metals really over the past 10,000 years, really beginning when humans themselves start using metals. This could even be pushed back farther if we look at metallurgical type materials, such as the use of red ochre pigments, but really focuses in on that specific use of metals. And what we see with early metal usage is that metals themselves were used long before the adaptation or creation of smelting. And these first metals that were used were found in what we would call their native form. So these weren't in any sort of ore form, but essentially they were pure elemental metals that people were able to procure and gather out of the ground, sometimes mining for them, and actually use these to work into different tools. You can see here a couple examples. One is a really thin piece that's still attached to the rock matrix. Another one is a piece of float copper that's been shined up. And what we see is that these copper pieces were used and manipulated without the use of smelting, and a lot of the early ones were used without the use of melting either. So they were worked in their solid form. And with early metal usage, again, what we're seeing is that the beginning uses of metal really predates smelting technologies, and it predates it by thousands of years. So this really is a big gap for when people start using metals to when metals become really a dominant technological type. So what we're seeing here is it's not a metallurgical revolution that often gets put forth by especially people in the past who are studying metals. But instead, the beginning of use of metals by humans is really a slow process, and it really takes thousands of years for when humans first began hammering the first pieces of native metal to when metal would become a very dominant technological type. Another thing we see with this early use of metals is that when metals first appear, they don't replace the different technologies that existed before them. A really good example of this is stone and bone tools, but instead they exist alongside them, and we actually see them both in use at archaeological sites. And oftentimes the metallurgical materials actually replicate and look very similar to, say, the bone or the stone tools that exist both before them and alongside of them. Another really important part to talk about with early metal use is that these metals were important for more than just their actual use. So instead of being able to take a piece of metal and say make a knife out of it, there is a deeper value to the metal that exists there. And this is a big part of my research. According to Wigan, mining and metallurgy in pre-industrial settings were often imbued with a rich symbolic content, the study of which illuminates various aspects of culture that have little to do with metallurgy per se. Mining communities like the Empora that distribute their products cannot be understood in a cultural vacuum. A really good way to look at this is that when we're looking at early metal use, we can't just look at what people were making and what they were using it for. We have to understand really the cultural background that these metals are coming from beyond just the use of the tools themselves. To give you an idea of some of the early use of metallurgy, this is a chart I took from Killick and Fenn's overview of archaeometallurgy as a field, and it gives you a really solid idea of some of the early metal usage over history. We see here that native copper was the first metal to be used, and they actually differentiate native copper versus smelted copper a couple thousand years later. And then we see this followed by other native metals such as silver and gold. Eventually, we do see alloys starting to be mixed in here, such as tin arsenic or even bronze arsenic about 1,000 years later. And then it's not until very recently that we see a lot more modern metals as we know them today, such as aluminum or titanium being used. The title for first metal usage in the world right now exists at an archaeological site in Anatolia called Archaeometallurgy. This dates to the late 9th millennia BCE. And what we see here is there are native pieces of copper that are being hammered, and then they're being periodically annealed in a fire to prevent stress fracturing and cracking. Jumped ahead too soon. Stress fracturing and cracking, and they're being made into ornamentation. And what we're seeing with these ornaments is that they're not necessarily tools, but instead they are really decorative pieces that people are making. This bottom one here could potentially be considered an awl, but we're seeing that they are these large, really small pieces that are being made into these large ornaments. And if we go to a different spot around the world and we zoom in on our area of focus tonight, we have North America's native copper industry. Now, one thing to note before I talk about this with old world metallurgy is that we really don't see metals become a really important technological system till about 5,000 years ago when smelting is developed. That's not quite the case here in North America. Now, I use the term native copper industry as a blanket term for covering really all metal usage that's centered around in the Great Lakes and the areas around it. There's a lot of different terms archaeologists use and have used over the last couple years, but I use this one just as my general blanket term. So I'm going to refer to this, I'm referring to really all the metalworking over the past 10,000 years when I use this term. And what we see here in North America is that about 9,500 years ago is kind of the date that people began using metals. And at this time and following this time, we see a metallurgical and technological system developed that really is a lot grander than we're seeing in the old world at this time. And we're seeing people heavily using native copper. Now, these native copper deposits exist both on Isle Royale and in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And one thing to note about these copper deposits are that this is the largest native copper deposit in the world. So the people living here are really at a unique location to access and use this copper. And the copper itself can be found both in the bedrock, but we also see it in areas lying south of these deposits. This is because as the glaciers came and they moved down across these deposits, they picked up a lot of the copper from the bedrock, and then they deposited it across the glacial landscape. A lot of this is centered in Wisconsin and the surrounding area. So people were actually, especially the first use of metals, it's thought that they're actually using float copper. And then later, a little bit later on, or roughly around the same time, we see people start to mine copper, potentially larger pieces of copper from both the Keweenaw Peninsula here and Isle Royale in the north. And what we see people doing is there's something that we would call informal mining. So informal mining describes a system in which people engage in mining activity only as a part-time thing. So the best way to think about this is people are moving around the landscape, they're in a group, and as they go to different locations seasonally to gather different resources, one of those resources is copper. This isn't a group of people mining copper as a full-time profession and then trading it out, but it's potentially different groups of people going through and mining this copper. And what we're seeing is there's really a kind of a three-stage thing for going in and mining the copper. The first one that I don't have listed here, so we could add a fourth stage, is actually finding the copper deposits to begin with. One way that this has been recommended actually is early in the morning, kind of during the fall or even the spring when the frost comes over. The metal is going to be taking in heat all day. So in the morning when that frost covers, it's going to be one of the first spots to melt. So that's potentially one way that people were identifying these copper deposits. Other ways is they're just visible on the surface. As you're walking through, say, the Keweenaw Peninsula or Isle Royale, you can see these copper veins actually sticking out in certain locations, and you can follow them to potentially larger deposits. But the first step that we see in mining copper is that you have to remove all of the overburden. You have to do some initial hammering to kind of clear out the area that you want to be mining the copper for. One way that this was helped, the overall mining, and this has been theorized, is fire setting and quenching. So you would have either a lode or a fissure of copper. Now, a fissure is going to be kind of a long vein. There's going to be bedrock alongside of it. A lode is going to be more of an amorphous clump of copper that's going to be also surrounded by bedrock. And you have to remove that bedrock to get to the copper. So a large fire would be started on the copper, and it would get it nice and hot on the metal, the rock around it. And then cold water would then be splashed on that rock, allowing it to fracture and allowing it to become brittle. And then large hammer stones could then be used to crush and remove that surrounding matrix. And there's been ideas of how these hammer stones were used. A lot of them are quite large. A lot of them are, maybe the size of a football or so. Some of them were hafted, some of them weren't, some of them are held in the hand. There's been different ideas of people using counterweights to hammer with them. But we know that people were breaking down this rock matrix and getting to that copper. The final step here would then be to pull out all that material from your mining area and separate the copper itself from its matrix by hammering that out, breaking that matrix down, and having a really nice transportable piece of copper that is both transportable and workable at the same time. To give you an idea of these copper mining deposits, this is a kind of a side picture of the Keweenaw Peninsula from Witchersley. And we can see three main areas of copper working. Can you follow my mouse? We have one down here by the Onstwell River. We have one up here kind of in the Houghton Hancock area. then we have one up here in the Copper Harbor area. And these are all, each little dot is a potential mining area. Now, the best way for me to describe these mining areas to you is the surface of a golf ball. I thought about including a picture of a mine, but you would just be looking at vegetation and trees. So I included this picture. And what these mines look like, especially at some of the larger mines on Isle Royale, is if you're standing on the surface, there are large depressions, one after the other in the ground. They can be a couple meters deep even to really shallow. And one thing to keep in mind with the depths of these is some of them are upwards of 10,000 years old, so they've been kind of backfilled over that time, but they're still really deep. And it's one after the other on some of the larger sites. Some of the smaller mining sites, you only see a couple depressions like this, but just to give you an idea, if you were standing on the ground at one of these large sites, this is what it would look like. Now, once people have the copper, what are they going to do with it? So to process this copper even farther and to make a usable item out of it, people were using a technique called cold hammering and annealing. There's a little caveat between the cold hammering and the hot hammering, but I'll get to that in a second. Essentially, what people were doing is they were taking these metals, and I'll do a demonstration of this towards the end and give a little more detail. And they were beginning to hammer it between a large stone anvil stone and a hammer stone in their hand. And they would hammer down on this copper, shaping it into the desired shape. Now, there was no melting, there was no smelting going on this. Metallographic studies have been done. Vernon does a really good job of this, looking at the microstructure of the copper to kind of determine how these are being made. And as the copper is, of course, being worked, the microstructure of the copper begins to break down. It begins to become brittle, it becomes hard, and it starts to fracture. So what people would do is they would take this and they would put it into a fire and they would anneal it. And the annealing is then allowing this the copper to regrow. These fires often, these are just your typical campfire. They weren't very hot necessarily in terms of metallurgy, so they weren't melting the metals, but they were providing a really solid anneal. The pieces can then be pulled out, they could be cooled down, and then they could continue working on the piece of copper. And this would be done multiple times, upwards of say 20, 25, 30 times, pulling that piece out, hammering on it, putting it back in the fire, pulling it out, letting it cool, hammering on it, and back and forth. Now, there has been some debate whether this was the exact practice that was being used with cold hammering and annealing, or if people were hot working the copper. Currently, the consensus is among archaeologists is that it's likely people were doing both. There's benefits and there are downsides to cold hammering versus hot hammering. I personally do a lot of cold hammering with my work, and a big advantage of this is it's a lot easier to manipulate with your hand without, say, a steel piece of pliers to hold the piece for you while it's red hot. That being said, that doesn't mean it's impossible to hot work it. It can be very efficiently done, for example, with two pieces of wood that are then tied together and dipped in water as your holder, or even pulling out the piece and leaving it on the anvil and just manipulating it when needed. So this brings us into the different technological shifts in native copper working over the past 10,000 years. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be covering a couple different periods, starting with really the origins of metalworking in the Upper Great Lakes. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about two different technological traditions, or also called archaeological cultures in this case, that coexisted at the same time that were using metals, and they more or less overlap on Isle Royale. The first one, and the one that a lot of people probably have heard of, if you've heard of ancient copper working in the Great Lakes, is called the Old Copper Complex. Now, the Old Copper Complex isn't necessarily a specific group of people, but it's more or less a kind of a conglomeration of copper-using cultures that were utilizing copper in a very similar way. They were making very similar implements, and they do share a lot of other similarities, but don't necessarily think of them as one homogeneous group. A recent paper actually in 2021 pushed the dates of the Old Copper Complex going back to about 9,500 years, kind of at its oldest edge right now. And the Old Copper Complex exists during a time period we call the Archaic period, which begins around 11,500 years ago, and it goes to about 2,500 years ago, roughly. You'll see the term BP used on my slide that refers to the term before present. And what we see is that the Old Copper Complex is centered around the large glacial region that I described earlier in Wisconsin. So there is a lot of potential float copper being used in the Old Copper Complex, as well as we see some evidence of copper mining taking place up in the Lake Superior copper regions. And the Old Copper Complex is coexisting with another very important copper using culture to the north called the Shield Archaic, which I'll get to in a second. And what we see with the old copper complex is that the tools that are being made out of the copper they tend to be very large, they're heavy, they're bulky, and they're primarily utilitarian. So these are primarily tools that are being made to do a task. Now, what that task is, it's been debated if it has, say, a more ceremonial context to it or not. One thing to bring up with these tools is that the old copper complex was actually first identified as a mortuary context. So there were some cemeteries that were excavated in Wisconsin, and they found these large fashioned tools in these graves. But an analysis of these tools showed that these tools were used. So it was initially thought to be mostly a mortuary context. More recently, archaeological work has been done throughout Wisconsin, and it's demonstrated that these aren't just limited to mortuary sites, but we do see copper usage on other sites, such as habitation sites where people are living. And some of the items that we're seeing in this old copper complex, we're seeing things such as knives, we're seeing large crescents, we're seeing awls, perforators, spuds, and different other types of tools, fish hook. But one thing I like to point out at this point is I use the term primarily utilitarian because we also see the use of ornaments, we see bracelets, pendants, rings, beads. So it's why people are making these large utilitarian tools, and they are putting some of them into mortuary context. They're also making different ornamentations. This map gives you an idea of the distribution of the old copper complex. We can kind of see the Lake Superior Copper District pointed out up here on the map with two little dots. One thing I do like to point out about a map like this is if you were to Google old copper complex, every map's going to have slightly different edges. So just be aware of that if you decide to look into this farther. The other culture that I mentioned that we were going to talk about is called the Shield Archaic. Now, the Shield Archaic exists roughly from about 6,500 years ago to about 3,500 years ago. Oops. And what we see with the Shield Archaic is this is a northern hunting and gathering complex, and it takes its name actually from the Canadian Shield, which is a large part of where these people are centered. And we see it more or less existing north of Lake Superior, but we do see the border of it extending down onto the north shore of Lake Superior and even down onto the north shore of Lake Huron. And what we see kind of as our time period, this really is kind of centered around the period we call the Middle Archaic, more or less the same period that we see the old copper complex centered around. We do see evidence of it kind of pushing the earlier envelope of that 6,500, and we do see evidence of it kind of pushing the later end of that at 3,500 BP into what we would call the early Archaic. And what we see with the Shield Archaic, one of the things that kind of makes it unique is that there is an extensive use of watercraft and woodworking as well being used specifically with copper tools. And we also see the exploitation of different animals such as moose, caribou, beaver, and fish being a very important one. The tools being used in the Shield Archaic are in some regards similar in type to what we're seeing with the old copper complex. And by that, I mean they are large and they are utilitarian primarily in focus. Some examples of these tools include large celts. We also see knives, we see spear points, fish hook, and other fishing implements such as a fish gaff. But what we're seeing with these tools is that tools such as an adze or tools such as a chisel are really being used for woodworking. Now, we don't see a lot of wooden artifacts being preserved at this, mostly because wood doesn't preserve the same way copper or stone does. So we don't really know what people were doing with the wood, but we see woodworking implements. A lot of them are being made out of copper tools. Another important thing, as I mentioned, is fishing. We're seeing a lot of important fishing tools, such as fish hooks, such as gaffs being used with the Archaic, the Shield Archaic. And again, if you think about where this is located, it's located in the upper Great Lakes, right on Lake Superior's north shore. So this provides really a good background for a lot of water usage, such as fishing. Now you'll see here two different maps that kind of highlight the distribution of the Shield Archaic. If we look at our map here on the right, you'll see the Shield Archaic. It exists up here along the Canadian Shield. And if you follow this red border, it actually, this map shows it overlapping with the old copper complex, including the north shore of Lake Superior. You'll notice that this map shows the old copper complex a lot smaller, and that's why I gave that little warning about being careful when looking at maps. And then this map over here calls it the Boreal Archaic, but it is referring to the Shield Archaic. Again, a very similar distribution going down and covering the north shore of Lake Superior. So moving on in time, we see we enter into the Woodland period. Now, the biggest difference between the Woodland period and the Archaic period that we just talked about is the introduction of ceramic. So how we mark the beginning of the Woodland period is that people begin using ceramic technologies. Now, this begins anywhere from 3,000 to about 2,000 years ago, depending on where you're looking at. And one of the really important copper using archaeological cultures that exist at this time is the Hopewell culture. So the Hopewell culture is centered in the region around Ohio and Illinois, and it is centered around what we would call a mound complex. So people were taking earth, so they were taking dirt, and they were making mound formations. These mound formations kind of varied. And some of them were, for example, in different shapes, such as ridgetop mounds or conical mounds. And the Hopewell is really characterized by an increase in complexity, elaborate mortuary ceremonialism, particularly centered around these mound sites, mound construction itself, as well as, which is important for our discussion, the consumption of prestige and exchange goods. Now, this consumption is what archaeologists like to call the Hopewell interaction sphere. So the Hopewell interaction sphere is a large, really continent-wide prestige good exchange that's stretching anywhere from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Atlantic coast, all the way over to the Rocky Mountains. And we see a lot of what we'd call exotic goods, exotic because they don't currently exist in the locations they're going to, being pulled into these areas around Ohio and Illinois. And for our sake, one of the things we're seeing pulled in actually is copper. So we're seeing copper coming up from up here in the Lake Superior region. And we also see what we would call the Laurel complex coming into being up in the upper Great Lakes. They share a lot of similarities in copper use to what we're seeing before, except we see a slight difference in how the Hopewell are using copper. So with Hopewell use for copper, the copper becomes a lot more ornate. It becomes a lot more symbolic and ritualistic. But more importantly, we're seeing copper used not primarily for utilitarian tools for everyday work, but instead they're being made into things that have these traits. A couple examples, we're seeing a lot of bracelets being made, elaborate breastplates, geometric and zoometric sheets. So these flattened out sheets of copper that are then being formed into the shape of something, bisymbols. To give you an example of what some of these look like, we have some images of bracelets here on our left. We have some copper sheets here in the center, and actually over on the left, we have a copper sheet of a bird, some bear claws. These are some of those geometric designs I mentioned. And we actually have a potentially a ceremonial headdress in the shape of antler horns. And if you're really interested in these and you're in Chicago, you can actually view these. I took these pictures myself at the Chicago Field Museum. And what we see with the distribution of the Hopewell interaction sphere, it's primarily centered again down here in Ohio and Illinois. It stretches up kind of throughout this region, and it doesn't really include what's going on here in the Upper Great Lakes. But like I said, what we're seeing in the Upper Great Lakes is that laurel complex, particularly defined by the creation of what we call laurel pottery up here, in which the copper from geochemical studies, we can see it's being procured up here in the Upper Great Lakes and being traded down here into kind of the lower Midwest. The very last cultural period that we're going to be talking about is the Mississippian period. Now, my little caveat with the Mississippian period is that when we talk about time in North America, and we mention the Mississippians, we only use that time period for areas that actually have the Mississippian culture, specifically the lower Midwest. In the upper Great Lakes, we would not refer to the Mississippian time period, but we would actually refer to the time period as what we would call the terminal woodland. So that woodland period that we saw earlier with the beginning of ceramics, we would continue that all the way till we see Europeans entering into the continent at this time. But in the lower Midwest, we have something called the Mississippians. And this really begins around 900 AD, all the way up to European contact, European cultures as they were coming in. The French and the English actually encultured some of these Mississippian sites. Now, the Mississippian way of life is marked by the intensification of maize-based farming, within a mix of subsistence economy, the emergence of local system in which linked settlements ranged in size from homesteads to large ceremonial and temple burial mound centers, the standardization of art styles over a vast distance, participation in long distance trade of exotic and elite goods, and an unprecedented level of legitimized socio-political authority. Now, one of the things you can notice here is that these are built around large mound centers, kind of a continuing what we saw beginning with the Hopewell interaction sphere. A lot of these were actually large platform mounds that they were able to then build on top of. A really good example of this is Cahokia or even Angel Mounds here in Indiana. And what we're seeing with the copper that's taking place, the reason I mentioned Mississippian is, again, we see this follows the trend that we're seeing with the Hopewell, is that the copper is moving away from being an item that's being used primarily for utilitarian purposes and moving into an item that is being used for a lot more, say, ritual regalia or different accessories than that. Examples that we're seeing of Mississippian copper include hair ornaments, ear gauges. We're also seeing copper-covered masks, ear spools, beads, headdresses. That being said, we do see some evidence of utilitarian tools still being made. For example, we see quite a few copper awls still being produced during the Mississippian. We're seeing, for example, celts and maces still being made. Now, by some of these could definitely have a ceremonial purpose within themselves. It is possible that these are also being used to some degree as a more utilitarian tool. And again, copper is a prestige good. It's being found at important ceremonial centers. A good example of this is that we see copper being found at Cahokia at a copper workshop. We also see copper, again, it's being used in the production of ritual regalia, accessories, adornment. And one of the interesting things we see with copper at this time is we see kind of a standardization of templates for crafting. A really good example of this is in some of those copper sheets. We're seeing multiple of these sheets being reproduced with the very similar design. Again, this gives you a kind of a general idea of where the Mississippian was located. So if it's within the shaded area, we would call this time period the Mississippian. But again, up in the upper Great Lakes here, we would call this the terminal woodland period. That being said, we are seeing copper moving down into the Mississippian areas from the upper Great Lakes. It should be noted, though, that the use of copper during this region does become a lot less than we're seeing in earlier periods of usage. The last thing to talk about is going back to the upper Great Lakes at the same time period. I apologize if this map is really hard to see. This is something I took from Cabin Clark looking at distribution of different pottery types. So each one of these maps is a distribution of pottery types in Lake Superior. And what's really interesting about it is there is a distribution of all these types of pottery, and then they're all found on Isle Royal. So what we see is that people traveling from different places in Lake Superior to Isle Royal to get copper for themselves. The last thing I want to discuss in this topic is going all the way back to the beginning of my presentation. I talked about that we have to understand metalworking in a cultural background. A really good way to do this is looking at the different beliefs around copper of indigenous groups that share ancestry from these native metalworkers. And if we look at the Ojibwe, for example, we see the existence of what we would call copper manitous. Now, to describe what a manitou is to you, it's a little difficult, especially from a Western mindset. I wouldn't go as far as to call it a spirit, but I also wouldn't call it a god. They really are their own unique entity, if that helps at all. And we have two different important manitous that are associated with copper. One is Mishabezi, also known as the white bear, the white lynx, the great lynx, and the underwater panther. And in Ojibwe mythology, the world is split into three parts. There's the upper world, the middle world that we live, and the lower world. But don't think of it as, say, a heaven and a hell, but think of it as the sky and then the underground. So we see that Mishabezi is kind of the chief of these underwater spirits, that underworld, as well as the owner and the guardian of copper. We also see Mishiginebeg, or the great serpent or horned serpent. Mishiginebeg is kind of the largest and the strongest of the underwater manitous. His scales, horns, and long coiled tail are all made of copper. So when people are procuring copper, they're actually getting it from Mishiginebeg directly. He is also known as being responsible for drownings and falling through the ice and general harm. And sacrifices to him are generally thought to bring good hunting, fishing, safe travel, as well as medicine powers over disease. And what I really want to emphasize here, talking about this, is that it's important to understand that metals aren't just a tool to be used, but they do have a a value to them that goes beyond their generalists, especially looking at the past 10,000 years of metal usage. And to quote Susan Martin, they really hold a wonderful power in them that's not just connected to what can we use them for. So now we are going to look at my demonstration. So I'm just going to need a second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if you're watching this for your Zoom, you haven't done it in your upper right corner, if you click view, you're going to want to click speaker view so that you can see me. And it's also very important that anybody is muted during this time, so it goes to my screen, because you're going to want to see my screen as a whole. So I'm going to turn off my virtual background so that you can see everything that I'm doing. And I'm going to take a second and tilt my camera down and get my anvil into place. Okay. So we should all be looking at my anvil. So when working copper, it really is you only need a couple of basic tools. The first one is a surface to hammer on. So I have a copper anvil. I actually got this from the Upper Great Lakes, and this is made of quartzite. So this gives me a solid flat surface that I can then hammer and manipulate my copper. The other thing I have here is two different hammer stones. They're two different sizes. Actually, at my workshop here at IU, I have about 7 to 10 different sizes. One of them is very large. This is about the extent of size that I would use. This probably weighs about 10 to 15 pounds. And if you're working copper for, say, a couple hours, this becomes really heavy in the hand. The other one I have is very small, very petite, and I use this for a lot more delicate copper working as a whole. The last kind of tool I have for copper working here is I have 2 pieces of red sandstone. I will use these as an abrader, and I'll use these actually to shape down the end of the copper, similar to you would a grinder or even sandpaper. This one's a lot more coarse. It's very hard. It allows me to get a lot more, kind of do the beginning work, get off a lot more stuff. And this one's a lot finer piece, and I use this for, say, sharpening a blade or kind of fine toothing the end. And I do use a variety of different kind of size grains for copper working. Now, if I lay out here on my table, I have a couple pieces of copper that I want to do a little working on. Overall, this process of cold working would take me a couple hours to do. So we're only going to get kind of a very brief demonstration how this is done tonight, because or else we would more or less be here all night. So there's a couple different stages that copper goes through as it's being worked. It really starts off as an unworked piece of copper. I happen to be using mostly float copper for my work. Versus mined copper. This is mostly because it's easier to procure more ethically. So this is a piece of, I'm going to go down, of unmodified float copper that's been cleaned off of any matrix. I should mention that each one of these pieces is pre-annealed. So when I begin working it, they are all ready to go. This is a piece that's already begun to be working. You can kind of see that flat surface if I tilt it like that. So this has had a couple hammer strokes, but not a lot of working done to it. I then have 2 examples here of bars that are going to be formed. So I would start by working off with my raw piece of copper. I would start by some initial hammering in. And really what I'm trying to do is form a copper bar, depending on what I'm trying to make. I could also be flattening this out more. So these are 2 different examples of bars. This one's a little farther along. You can see it's a lot thinner. This one's a lot chunkier. And then I'm going to be working these into what I would call a preform. So this is a piece of copper that's been really drawn out. It's kind of longer in shape, and it's starting to get to the shape that I actually want to use. This is actually a piece I've abandoned working on in the past. And the reason being, and you're not going to be able to see it well on your camera, is right where my finger is, there's a very large crack. So this piece is ready to actually break in half, but it's perfect for our demonstration here tonight. And the final thing you're going to get is your finished artifact. So this is a piece I actually finished last week. It is a semi-socketed knife. And I'll use this as my demonstration to kind of show you some of the grinding. So safety first. Put on my safety glasses so nothing comes up at my face. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with this piece here. I'm going to put it on my anvil, and I'm going to start with my larger anvil stone. Now, this does make a very loud sound. It's possible my speaker will cut out because it goes above its frequency. It's also possible you're going to hear very loud hammering on your end. So I do apologize if loud noises are going to bother you a little bit. You might want to consider muting, but you will miss some of what I'm speaking at. So that was my little warning there. So what I want to do is I want to start forming this into a bar. So it's kind of a longer piece. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to start hammering on this edge to kind of start smushing it down and drawing it out into that bar. So I take my large stone, get it so it's comfortable grip in my hand, and I'm just going to begin hammering away at this. and knocked my camera over. That's okay. So I began hammering and I've started to deform the piece. You can kind of see the deformation on the top there and kind of there. And if I move this along the side here, can you still see? Just this. Okay. There we go. One thing you'll notice is one of the really big advantages of cold working this copper is I'm able to hold it in my hand. So if I was hot working this, obviously I wouldn't want to be touching it. I have to be either holding it with something else. Again, I don't have a steel pair of pliers, and I would have to be holding it at a distance. So holding it up like this with something, say, made of wood would be a little harder. That being said, if it was hot, it would hammer and move a lot quicker. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So what I begin to do is I begin to flatten that out. So what I want to do is I don't want to flatten it out too quickly that way. So I want to kind of adjust and start hammering along the other way. What I'm essentially doing with this piece is I'm starting to flatten it down and to make a bar form. So I'm going to move on to the next piece in my thing, this piece that's already been hammered. And again, all I'm doing is as I'm continuing to work this down is I'm going towards more of a bar shape. Now, if I had a specific idea in mind, I could alter the shape and size of that bar. I'm just generally hammering these ones for the purposes of this demonstration. Now you'll notice I pulled my hand away there. This piece is very small. And this hammerstone is very large. So I'm actually going to switch for this purposes of this demonstration, just to show you to my more fine-tooth hammerstone at this point. Again, while I'm doing this process, I'm constantly rotating this piece, trying to make sure it's nice and even. If I hammer too long along one side, it's going to start to kind of splay out, and it's going to start to fracture along the edge. And I really want to try to control for that the best that I can. Again, I'm hammering this down and I'm moving along. I should mention, if I was doing this in my workshop, I would hammer these slightly longer than you're seeing me do right now. And I'm kind of just moving us through the process itself. So let's move on to the bar. I'm going to choose this bar and kind of leave this bar to the side. So now that I have my bar formed, what I want to do is I really want to start getting it into the shape of the tool I'm making. So with this one, for example, I could decide to flatten it out, maybe draw it into an awl. The fact that it's already drawn out so flat like this makes me think I might want to make something like a knife out of this. So I'm going to continue hammering this out along its length, and I'm actually going to begin forming the tip by hammering on this corner, trying to form that blade as I draw out the piece itself. One thing to be careful of, for example, when I made this piece, it looks very short and stout because when I made it, I drew it way too flat this way, way too quickly. So it ended up being a lot more stout of a blade than I wanted. I wanted it to be probably about another inch or so longer, which I learned for the next item. So again, I'm going to use my smaller hammerstone. It's just a little easier to hold in my hand for this demonstration purpose. And I'm going to begin hammering on this, starting with that edge corner that I pointed out. And again, I'm constantly flipping this around in my hand, manipulating it, and I'm also trying not to hit my hand. So again, I started hammering along this end. I want to flip it down, and I want to hammer again along this because I'm also drawing it slightly. And if you can kind of see, I'm already starting to flatten out the blade. I'm starting to shape this end, and I'm starting to continue to draw it out. And the final thing I would get is if I kept flattening that out, I'd get something more like this. You can see there's more of a shape to this blade already, and it's already kind of elongated out. It's also a lot thinner. So I would call this a preform. So I would, again, continue to work this out. One of the things I would do is this is going to be my bladed end, and this is pretty far along. I want to thin out this blade, and I want to make it nice and sharp and nice and tapered. My first couple knives I made were actually they weren't tapered very well, and they had a very hard time staying sharp because of how kind of just thick and clunky the blade was, and they took a lot of grinding to get into shape. So if I can do this part now, I can draw this out really well and give us a nice fine blade. Again, I'm just hammering down along the blade. Also important at this point is why this blade gets thinner and thinner. Again, if I keep just hammering it just along this side here, this is going to start to kind of splay out and fracture. So I do need to do some slight hammering even onto the blade itself, or it will start to break apart as I'm trying to thin out the blade. So hammering itself is very light. I'm not trying to deform it down, but I do need to control the very thinness along this edge. So as I work this, one of the things I do as I'm working the blade, I would also start working the tang of the blade depending on what type of thing I wanted to do. This I would, for example, if I wanted to make a socketed point like my other finished point here, I would want to thicken this out this way and draw it out this way. So I would hammer along this, and then I'd hammer back and forth there, drawing that out both directions really. And at the very end, what I would do with that is I would have it kind of splayed out like this. And I would then use a mandrel. For this, I actually had another copper bar I placed right into the socket itself. And I actually bent the copper down around that mandrel. The other thing you'll notice about this point is it has a little hole in it. This would aid in hafting purposes. So how I made this actually is I took a copper awl, so a perforator, I put it into the copper and I hammered down on it, making a punch essentially. And it punched out a little bubble on the one side. I then took my abrader here, actually this one, and I just abraded just on that bubble, and I kept doing it until the hole appeared. A little hole appeared from that. I flipped it around. I did that one more time, pushing my punch down into it, and then I was able to just abrade that more or less flat, opening up a nice square hole because I had a square punch. And then to kind of finish it off, I did a little hammering to flatten it out, providing what you see there. And so if I get to this point, then I need to do some final shaping and sharpening. This is where my abrader is going to come into play. So I'm going to use this, and I'm just going to kind of sharpen this very similar to what you see with a whetstone. So working my way down the blade and just grinding this off. I'd also use this to shape up any other unpleasant parts that may have come up throughout the process, and really to give the blade a nice clean shine. As you can see, that is a lot shinier than even that piece itself. So to give you an idea of what these kind of start off as, I have two pieces of float copper here. They still have their cortex on them and their patina on them, just to give you an idea of what that float copper looks like. And I also have, I'm actually going to go briefly back to my PowerPoint right here. So we're screen 2. And give you an idea of some of the work that I have been doing. Okay, there we go. So with this experimental working, I should put this back on my face. Take off my glasses. I've been doing a couple different things with experimental copper working. The big one that I'm working on currently actually is looking at the waste production that's being produced from the copper itself. So as I'm working this, I'm actually taking and grinding as I go along this process, because as the copper is being deformed, it kind of creates these little scales that start to stick off as you're elongating it doing this process. And you kind of grind those off as you go so they don't elongate and kind of cause flaws in the piece. And I'm collecting all those, and I'm collecting any other waste pieces that come up, any other pieces that fail as I'm working them. And I am then using that to compare to what we're seeing on archaeological sites. So I'm in the phase right now of going through working on my pieces. My goal then is to have kind of a comparison for the different archaeological sites that we have excavated. And this is another list of some of the other projects that I am working on or am trying to work on. To give you a better idea of the stages I went through, I would really define the copper production in 5 main stages, and you could differentiate some of these even farther. We started off with our raw piece without our matrix. We got to stage 2, which is kind of your hammered piece, and that kind of it can either be kind of Swiss cheese because you just knocked out all the matrix, or it can be a nice solid homogeneous piece. From there, you're going to work that down into a bar, as we see here, kind of in the center picture. And again, that bar shape can be different things. For example, if you're trying to make a sheet of copper, you're not going to make a bar. You're actually just going to start flattening that out right away, shaping the edges of it. From there, you're going to get into your preform. Your preform is kind of your farther along the way bar or flattened out piece, and you're going to end with your formal tool. And the thing that I'm researching is this production process. So everything before this final formal tool, all the way back here, and looking at these stages and looking at the waste products being produced, and looking at where these different steps are being done on the landscape as people are moving away from the copper source. For example, on Isle Royal, are people just kind of beginning these first 2 stages and then taking it and moving away, or are they working it all the way to the end while they're there? give you an idea of some of the copper pieces. This is the display case I have in my office. I have some of these pieces next to me that I could show up to the camera too, if anybody would like to see that. But you can see some of the knives I made. These knives are actually, if you start on the top here, this is the first knife I ever made. I actually started off with modern tools, so this one doesn't really count. This is my first knife I tried to make using cold hammering and annealing. I never finished it. As you can see, it's pretty rough shape. It had a major fracture to it. Kind of going down to my more recent knives, I have some crescents here, some other flattened pieces, some beads. I've made quite a lot of rings, actually. They're a really good way to practice drawing out the pieces. So these are just the four I have in my display case, but I made quite a bit. And then some copper over here on the side. If this was very interesting to you, you can actually check out, I have a website where I make videos, I do photo galleries of this, and this is called Cold Hammered Archaeology. And here's the web link for this. Also, if you'd like to get a hold of me after this presentation to ask any questions or anything such as that, I've also provided my email here, rypeter@iu.edu. So a lot of these pieces actually that were shown on the last screen, I either have video galleries or videos of me working it. This was supposed to be a live demonstration, so I wanted to include this link. If you want more of a thorough walkthrough of working a piece of copper, I have some videos and tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than what I did here tonight. That being said, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I am happy to take any questions that you guys might have. And I'll leave this up for another second or two if you want to copy it down.